broadcast for shooters, hunters, and gun enthusiasts. This is the Firearms Radio Network. The bandwidth for this episode of Gun Guy Radio is sponsored by Patriot Patch Company. PatriotPatch.co.
Hello and welcome to Gun Guy Radio. This is the podcast that shines a positive light on the firearms lifestyle. I'm your host, Ryan Machad, and this is your weekly dose of positive firearms talk without the politics. Today, I'm joined by Nathaniel F. of the Firearm blog to discuss the current state of military small arms ammunition and where it might be headed in the future. So as always, please consider supporting the Firearms Radio Network by shopping Amazon using our Amazon affiliate link at firearmsradio.tv/Amazon. A portion of your purchase will go towards helping the FRN create awesome pro-gun content like this show. Also, please check out the Patriot Patch Company and their current patches available for order. Check them out at patriotpatch.co. So Nathaniel, good to have you back on the show.
Nice to be back.
Shot anything interesting recently, or?
Not really anything that exotic. I've just been trying to keep up my normal routine. I'm working on an M1 Garand right now. Not particularly exotic rifle, but it's a project gun of mine. I've got some posts on the Firearm blog about the modifications I'm doing to it. So it's a CMP gun and it has new wood on it. So I'm working on the wood, so I'm not hurting any of the original parts, but it's an interesting project. You sort of get Stockholm syndrome with a gun like that. There's so many ins and outs that you sort of get absorbed in.
You keep asking me if you want to, you're trying to find a revolver, and you keep sending me messages, and I'm like, oh, just buy one. I know you want one.
Well, of course I want a revolver. But I need to get more into that world. That's one of the areas of firearms that I'm not as sort of deep into. I've done quite a bit of revolver shooting, but not. I've never owned one. So, which to your listeners must just be like, oh my God, really? Who's this guy think he is? He's never owned a revolver.
Get so offended.
Yeah.
Do you shop on Amazon? How about your spouse? Does your mom? Does your company? Why not use the Firearms Radio Network's Amazon affiliate link next time you shop Amazon? Bookmark firearmsradio.tv/Amazon or click through the Amazon link in the right-hand corner of firearmsradio.tv. Get it? Got it? Amazon it.
So caliber configuration. Now, when you first proposed this topic to me, I will admit I was kind of like, where are you going with this? What exactly do you mean? Now, a lot of people know why certain calibers are the way they are, like 357 Magnum. Why is it so long? Well, extended 38 special, stuff like that. But in terms of military calibers, oftentimes there are more specific needs and desires from the military people, and that will shape what caliber they use, how it's designed or how it's employed. So basically, what do you want to cover with this topic? Right.
So this is a really interesting subject, and a fellow of mine who probably wouldn't want to be named on the show, who's a friend of mine, talked to on email, said once that it's small arms, so everybody's an expert. Which means that kind of everybody has their finger in the pie, and they all have their opinions on what should be the caliber here or the caliber there. You got a lot of people who are fans of 308, for example. So the two calibers, for those who may not know, that are the standard issue small arms calibers for the United States military right now are 5.56x45, which in the civilian market has got a counterpart called 223 Remington, and 7.62x51 NATO, which on the civilian market also has a counterpart called 308 Winchester. And a lot of people have this kind of feeling that bigger is better, and so you'll get a lot of people on the internet who think that moving to the 5.56 millimeter caliber was a mistake, that 308 or 7.62x51 was the superior choice because it hypothetically has better knockdown power, that sort of thing. And there's really a complex topic to be had here. It's not that simple. So the example I used in a post that you'll be linking in your show notes, where I cover a lot of this topic, and I cover the history more in depth in that post as well, is that you kind of have, if you imagine a 50 BMG, or you imagine a 22 long rifle or something like that. I mean, those are two very, very different calibers, right? But they both have characteristics that the military wants in standard issue calibers. 50 BMG, it's very big, it's very powerful, it has incredible amounts of energy, great amounts of range, right? 22 long rifle has no recoil. It's very small. Militaries fight wars of economy these days, which means that you need to be able to produce lots of it, and you can produce lots of 22 long rifle, that sort of thing. So you have to strike a balance somewhere with small arms calibers. You have to be able to say, we need to weigh these needs against those needs, and you need to be able to find out what's most important and do it in the most economical way possible. So that's kind of what we're going to dive into today, and different ideas on how to do that, and kind of where maybe things are headed, maybe how to make small arms calibers more effective and more economical in the future.
Well, from a historical perspective, you look at what we were using in the late 1800s, or, mid to late 1800s, and then move slowly forward through the 30-06 and then over to the 5.56. And it's kind of in part due to our better understanding of how bullets perform in targets. Because, back in the day it was, we'll just launch the heaviest and biggest bullet that is feasible out of the firearm. So you were looking at, what were some of the muskets, like 69 caliber, and then we moved over to like 45-70 and stuff like that. And now, we're going smaller and smaller because we understand how to impart that energy from the round more efficiently. So we were able to go even smaller.
Right. And so when you have you can be somebody who agrees with the choice of 5.56 or not, but one of the reasons that it was designed was because there was a better understanding of the mechanics of the way these bullets worked in tissue, and that exploiting that understanding allowed you to be even more economical. And I don't want to get too much into the history because people can read about that all they want, but it really has been an evolution, and I think there's a little bit of a disservice that's done a lot of the times where talk about how there's really nothing new in the ammunition world. All of these metallic cartridges were invented in the late 19th century, and they've more or less stayed the same. That's not 100% true. There's actually been pretty much a continuous development of different bullet technologies and production technologies. Sometimes it feels excruciatingly slow, and I'll definitely admit that, but it has been a continuous development. So going from round nose bullets to Spitzers to higher velocity Spitzers to what we have now with the very advanced EPR bullets that we'll talk about later in the segment.
So basically, the development of the 5.56, how did that get started? Like, when did we see that point in time where we started really looking at the performance and soft tissue of these rounds and discovered, hey, I don't need a 30-06 to do what I need to do?
Right. So that originally starts in the 30s, and you and I talked about the 276 Pedersen in the previous Gun Guy Radio that we did. And that's really actually where the roots of 5.56 get laid, because they find out that kind of counterintuitively, sometimes these smaller bullets deal significantly more damage to the target than the larger ones do. And they want to find out why that is. And so there's a paper called A Theory of Motion of a Bullet About Its Center of Gravity that was published, I want to say, in 1930. And that paper describes the fact that the yaw of a given projectile design is going to be proportional to its caliber. So the length of time that it takes for a 50 caliber projectile to yaw, if it's the exact same design, will be twice as long as a 25 caliber projectile of the exact same design. And that lays the groundwork for the research that would happen in the early 1950s for what became known as small caliber high velocity. And that whole concept, calibers like 5.56, 5.45 by 39, 204 Ruger, the 5.8 by 42 Chinese, those can all be grouped together under the small caliber high velocity label. They're smaller than traditional, and they have higher muzzle velocities.
Well, and you see, like, it was kind of funny to look and see what each country was using, maybe from 1900 through 1950. You have some European countries using a 6.5 Mannlicher with the very long bullet, and then you have people like Russia using a 7.62, which they were kind of ahead of the curve there.
Yeah. That's an interesting sort of period, because you have from 1904 to 1954, 50 solid years where nobody successfully standardizes a caliber below 298 inches, so just under 30. And that's like really conspicuous. And the reason that happens is towards the end of the 19th century, they've discovered the principle of you make things smaller in caliber, and you make things higher and higher in velocity, and you make the bullets longer and longer and longer, and you can maintain penetration, get lower recoil, and lower ammunition weight. And they start taking that to extremes. And so in the 1880s, 1890s kind of time frame, you start seeing calibers in like the 5mm range that are experimental. Military calibers, and they're going to like adopt these like hilarious looking 5mm round nose bullets that look like, you know, darning needles or something, and that development gets cut off because a couple of different bullet types get invented. The armor piercing bullet type. This is something that comes from the naval sector. They had started creating armor piercing bullets for naval warfare because the ironclads had come into power, and so you start having steel cord armor piercing bullets. You start having tracers, which get invented, I think in like the 19-teens. And so they need these different bullet types, and the smaller bullets are not at the time capable of accepting all of this variety that they need. And then in 1905, the Spitzer bullet is popularized. Now, it wasn't invented by the Germans. It was invented by the French in 1898, but they kept it secret. It was really with the Espatron that the Germans developed in 1905 that becomes popularized, and suddenly you have a way forward. You have approximately a 30 caliber bullet with a Spitzer contour that's much more aerodynamic in supersonic flight than a round nose bullet. And so it can be much lighter and much higher velocity, which is what they were trying to get to before with the smaller calibers. And you can put armor piercing bullets, tracer bullets, those sorts of things into it. And that's where the 30 caliber sort of dominance comes from. And for 50 years, that is pretty much the rule of the day, is that 30 caliber is the military rifle caliber, more or less, sometimes 8mm, but.
Now, was 5.56 the one that really got the SCHV concept going?
Right. 5.56 was the first SCHV issue caliber, and that development happens pretty much exclusively in the United States in the early 1950s. They started developing a 22 caliber round. William C. Davis and I can't remember his first name, the guy by the name of Gustafsson, are working on this HAHV problem, and they rechamber M2 carbines, the select fire version of the carbine, for 22 Aberdeen Proving Ground carbine, which is it's a cut down 222 Remington, and chambered with this little stubby 22 caliber bullet. And that is the foundation for SCHV moving on. They do experiments with that round, and then they do experiments with a neck down 7.62 NATO for 22. So if you can imagine like a 7.62 NATO necked all the way down to 22, so it's even more ridiculous than 243 Winchester. And that shot about a 68 grain bullet. And they found out that the muzzle velocity range that they wanted was 3,300 feet per second. And they literally took the 41 grain bullet of the 22 Aberdeen Proving Ground carbine and the 68 grain bullet of what became known in collector circles as the 22 NATO, but it never really had a name. They took those two weights and they averaged them to come up with 55 grains, which to anybody familiar with 223 Remington will sound very, very familiar. And that's how they came up with that bullet weight. And they designed bullets in that caliber, and they started testing it in 222 Remington. That's the original caliber of the AR-15. Conark had solicited Armalite to develop basically a small version of their AR-10. What came out of that was the AR-15, originally chambered in 222 Remington. And they found out that was just not quite big enough. That was not quite enough gas. And that's where you can imagine it as a 357 Magnum, except for 222 Remington. And that's where 223 came from. Originally called 222 Remington Special. And by this point, Remington had about 3 or 4 222 calibers running around. So they decided to change one of the numbers just to make it less confusing. And then that got standardized as 5.56 in 1970. This was after the Vietnam kind of tragedy of the AR-15s failing in Vietnam.
Right.
That was when the AR-15 was standardized and the M14 was retired from frontline service in the United States. So they had trialed AR-15s in Vietnam. They had used them in Vietnam as a frontline weapon. This was all part of the whole McNamara situation, where he had put his foot down. There had been this scandal with the M14. He'd put his foot down. He'd canceled the M14 and forced the Army to adopt the M16. And that led us to that had a lot of growing pains associated with it. That's a very long story that really deserves its own podcast. But that was where that came from. And by 1970, the U.S. had committed to 5.56, and it was right after ramming 7.62 by 51 NATO down NATO's throat. And that kind of unleashed this arms race because NATO now had to standardize a second caliber before everybody ran off in different directions. Because maybe, the British are, we won on the SCHV boat, so we're going to develop the 4.85 by 49 British caliber. And they had to conduct trials to determine the standard caliber. And what won was a modified version of 5.56 coming out of Belgium called SS-109. And that SS-109 became the groundwork for all of the different NATO 5.56 calibers. The one in the United States called M855. They're slightly different, but not meaningfully. Okay. So M855 was the state of the art until 2010 for the United States. And in 2005, we began working on a program for a new higher lethality bullet. And what's interesting about that is that they were really, really worried that if they called it a high lethality bullet, that it would get shut down for Geneva Convention for Hague Convention reasons, rather. And so instead of doing that, they kind of cloaked it under this air of being a green program, of being lead-free. And there are reasons to want a lead-free bullet. You want to be able to train your soldiers, and to do that, you need to have access to ranges. And if ranges are trying to be environmentally conscious, they may tell the Army to, screw off because they're dumping a bunch of lead into the berm. So it is kind of a part of this whole more green awareness thing that I realize a lot of people are annoyed about, but it's not directly the Army going, we need to be better with Mother Earth. It's more the Army going hey, there's a bunch of ranges in Europe that are not letting us shoot on the ranges anymore. So we need to be able to do that.
Right.
And that's a secondary requirement for the program. The primary requirement is lethality and accuracy. And that's what comes out of that is the M855A1. And that's an extremely impressive bullet design. I mean, we want to talk about the state of the art of projectile design advancing. That's an extremely impressive bullet design. It has far superior penetration to M855. I think it actually has better penetration than 7.62 M80. So you're getting the kind of penetration that you would expect out of a 7.62 rifle from a 5.56. And it also has a very low fragmentation threshold, which means that you can reach out with it and the bullet will fragment and be very lethal. And it's also a lot more accurate than a M855. So
now, what about the countries that were under the Soviets at the time? The satellite countries and everyone there, because did they all standardize under 7.62 by 39 and 54R?
Right. So this kind of goes back to the whole Sturmgewehr conversation, where the 7.62 by 39 was a direct result of the Russian experiences on the Eastern Front. And in fact, in the solicitation for 7.62 by 39, I am told, I haven't read it because I don't read Russian, but I'm told that in that solicitation they explicitly reference the German 7.92 by 33 Kurz caliber. And that became their standard issue caliber. But for a while, it wasn't sure exactly what kind of rifle they were going to standardize on. And eventually that became the famous Kalashnikov into the 1950s. And the Russians had a very, very good intelligence game. And I should mention they forced all of their client states basically to adopt 7.62 by 39. They said, the famous case being the Czechs. The Czechs had already developed their own round, the 7.62 by 45, and the Russians said, no, you're not doing that. You're adopting 7.62 by 39, and so they did. The Russians had a very good intelligence network, and so as soon as testing of the SAHV rounds begins in the United States, as soon as any of that's publicized, the Russians have their hands on ammunition that duplicates its ballistics. So by 1959, so the U.S. Army is forced to adopt the M16 in 1963. In 1959, the Russians had already begun ballistic testing of 5.56, 4 years earlier. And that program eventually results in 1967 in the 5.45 by 39. And eventually results in the 7N6 of 1974 and the AK-74. And that caliber is ballistically a little bit better optimized than 5.56. It's kind of based on some experiences that are kind of, it's sort of almost a second generation SCHV in a ballistic sense, although its projectile design is more primitive. It does not exhibit the kind of fragmentation that 5.56 does. In some ways, it's less lethal. But in terms of retaining its velocity, it does that better than 5.56 does. It has less recoil. It's lighter. So it's more optimized in that way.
It's longer, too. Would it have a better ballistic coefficient?
It actually goes the other way. It has the same ballistic coefficient as M855 with a lighter bullet. So it's able to economize on that in that way. They drove it. So their whole rationale for 5.45 by 39 was logistics. They wanted something that was going to consume far less materials than 7.62 by 39, and they got it. I mean, they got something that consumes something like 40% less materials. I mean, it was a major change. And then the Chinese had used 7.62 by 39. They had picked that up from the Russians, and they were continuing to use that into the 1980s. They never switched to 5.45 by 39. Eventually, a program was started at the very end of Mao Zedong's reign as chairman for a new infantry rifle caliber. It really gained steam when Deng Xiaoping took office, and that became the 5.8 by 42 Chinese caliber. That was called the DBP 88 and the DBP 87. The 88 was a slightly longer, heavier machine gun round. And eventually they decided they didn't like having both of those rounds in service, and they standardized on the DBP 10 in 2010. And the DBP 10 has an armor-piercing bullet, actually not all that dissimilar to a tiny M2AP 30-06 bullet, similar kind of construction. And I think it's got a muzzle velocity of about 3,000 feet per second, something like that. So it's still very SCHV. It's got a slightly more efficient ballistic coefficient. And that gives it sort of, you can imagine something like 5.56, but with a bit more punch at range, sacrificing at the same time that sort of better terminal ballistics that we've, in the United States, come to kind of really emphasize with the global war on terror. That's been something that has become extremely important for us, is having good sort of stopping power, if I may use that term. So that basically,
would you say that's basically where we are today in terms of the small caliber high velocity?
Right, yeah. It's a dominant concept. For the most part, the countries of the world use small caliber high velocity, either 5.56 or 5.45 or 5.8 for their standard infantry weapons and their squad support weapons. There are some exceptions, but they're pretty minor. Some people still using 7.62 by 39. The Finns are a good example of that. And then backing that up, you have larger calibers. For Russia and China, it's 7.62 by 54R. For the United States, it's 7.62 NATO. And that's used for things like GPMGs and that sort of thing.
So what about the people who just are unhappy with the 5.56? They don't subscribe to the SCHV concept, really, and they want an alternative. Right.
So M855, to understand that, we kind of have to go back to M855. And M855 had kind of a schizophrenic release. They had wanted, FN was obviously trying to sell it to the U.S. government because they knew it would be standardized through NATO if it was. And so FN kind of at the same time as saying it's more lethal because it has more range, it has better penetration, they were trying to say it's less lethal because it's more humane. It doesn't have as dramatic terminal effectiveness, so people don't need to worry about violating the Hague Convention. It's sort of an interesting kind of doublespeak in their literature at the period. And it turns out that M855 sometimes performs really well against soft targets. Sometimes it tumbles and fragments and creates this big cavity and does some pretty nasty things to its target and stops them very well. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't have those effects. It zips right through the target. And because of this, many people kind of paying attention to the situation decided that was a flaw with 5.56 caliber in general, and they wanted to change calibers to something that they felt would be more effective. So probably the most famous example of this would be the 6.8 by 43 Remington SPC. This was developed as a way to get terminal performance closer to 7.62 by 39, which the designers felt had better terminal effect than 5.56, and while maintaining the sort of flatter trajectory of 5.56. So it's got the same diameter bullet as like a 270 Winchester hunting rifle, fired at much lower velocities. It fits inside of an AR-15 with some modifications. And this was, they pushed this cartridge really hard. They got the backing of Remington, as the name implies. They pushed this cartridge really hard as a military round. And it kind of turns out that while there's some merit to that. For example, I know of some hog hunters who appreciate the round because I guess they have a whole lot of money. The round's not cheap, and they appreciate the extra sort of terminal effectiveness that some of the loads for it bring. But that concept never really gained traction. Another caliber that might fit into that concept would be the 300 Blackout. That's something that has ballistics very similar to the 7.62 by 39. That was really designed more as a suppressed caliber with an option for an intermediate velocity supersonic round. So it wasn't exactly designed around the lines that I'm talking about, but it is something that has been proposed several times as improving the effectiveness versus 5.56. But that concept, just that change in caliber, was not really logistically feasible. How are you going to change to a new caliber and then convince all of NATO to do it? And for a gain that is a little bit nebulous, especially when there's significant question that rounds like that may not actually be as effective as the proponents of them think they are.
It seems like every few years there's some magazine article. Will this replace the 5.56?
Yeah, and that, I mean that's something that I think sells good copy. The rounds themselves may have merits and demerits. I wrote an article a while back talking about how 6.8 SPC is not ballistically all that impressive, which it's not, but that doesn't make it a bad caliber. I mean, I think it's a fine caliber. It's not everything its proponents crack it up to be. And so there are things like the 25-45 sharps that have come out. Again, people trying to seek more effectiveness by changing the caliber. And this is taken kind of to a logical extension by probably the next topic, which is the idea of a GPC. A GPC being a general purpose cartridge. This is a concept that Anthony G. Williams came up with. This is a writer from Britain who has written some novels and done some writing about military technology and given presentations at National Defense Industry Association's conference. And what he proposes is a cartridge that's in the same basic bracket as like the 6.8 SBC, but that would be a bit longer and has a little bit more propellant, probably would be 6.5 millimeter caliber, and has a longer bullet with a much better ballistic coefficient. And his idea is to match performance of 7.62 NATO with as little recoil as possible to replace both 5.56 and 7.62 with one round. So we would be going back to the paradigm we had in the 1930s, where we had one round for all of our uses, which was at that time 30-06. But this caliber would be in the sort of a little bit more powerful than something like 7.62 by 39 or 6.8 SPC, but not as powerful as 7.62. And the concept of unifying the calibers like that is something that I think people should pay attention to, and it's something that I think has some promise, but there are also some limitations to that idea that especially the people who get very excited about that idea tend to forget. When we talk about military ammunition, we talk about this ammunition being economical, right? We want every shot to be as cheap as possible because fundamentally we're fighting wars that cost money, and we want them to cost as little money as possible. And especially if we get into a very big war, you run into the problem of, am I getting more out of the money that I'm spending than the other guy? And so when you decide that you're going to switch to a round that costs more and weighs more and recoils more, those disadvantages have an impact. And you have to make sure that impact has benefits that are meaningful for your infantry. And Anthony Williams' goal with this was to create a round that had better range, better lethality, and all that's fine, but you have to think about the weapons that's being applied to. If it's being applied to like the light machine gun or the squad automatic weapon, then those probably have enough sort of inherent range because they're fully automatic to exploit a cartridge that's designed for 800 to 1,000 meters of distance. Something like a carbine held by a 19-year-old troop may not. So it's not that there certainly is merit to that idea. I'm not trying to badmouth it, but it's something that there's a very careful set of balances that need to be paid attention to, and I think that a lot of research needs to go into that subject to come out with the right answer. That you need to have a lot of groundwork laid. You need to do studies on suppression and how suppression works and that sort of thing. You need to come up with an answer of, okay, now we know how to optimize for suppression, and then how do we need to do economic studies on how what would be the difference in economics for using a 2 caliber system versus a 1 caliber system. And that's a really in-depth subject, but we can get into as much as you want on the show here. But there's a lot of nitty-gritty details that are worth discussing. And in the show notes, for those who want to dive deeper into it, we will have some links to stuff I've written about the subject previously that goes into much, much more detail about the GPC concept and its strengths and particularly its weaknesses, because I have been a critic of it. As Ryan knows, I'm very fond of playing devil's advocate. So if anybody is very into an idea, I like to come in and talk about all the ways that it's bad. So so a lot of the writing is sort of coming from that angle of, here are some things you're not thinking about, and I'm gonna actually like tell you what the weight difference is between these two concepts. So it's not that it's a bad idea, but it is something that needs to be carefully weighed against the other opportunities.
Now, kind of looking towards the future, first of all, how do you see stuff being improved with SCHV? And then, like, what about the stuff that, like, okay, everybody in video games, the HKG11, the caseless stuff. Mm-hmm. How does that kind of factor into it?
Yeah, well, let's talk about SCHV first, because I think that there's a sentiment that I get a lot in my comments whenever the subject comes up, which is that 5.56 has reached the end of its development. Well, I don't really think so. And I think that the 5.56 caliber, we've just seen a massive increase in its capability with the M855A1 EPR, which is a terrific bullet. There's an article, again, that will be linked in the show notes. I'll have a whole list of required reading for people, where William Purnell of the Wound Channel did a great video on his YouTube channel showing how much fragmentation you get out of that round and how short of a neck it has, which is the distance it takes to start tumbling and fragmenting in the wound cavity. And so that's a massive improvement already, right? So as recently as 2010, we've gotten massive improvements in the lethality of 5.56. So who's to say that there may not be other things that we can do with the caliber? But also, if you're going to a new caliber paradigm, which sort of relates to what we're about to talk about, if you're going to change calibers anyway, there are other things you can do still within approximately 22 caliber. The bullets for 5.56, their ogives and their aerodynamic shaping is relatively poor because they were trying to economize on length. And so you could, like 5.45 or even more dramatically than 5.45, have a longer bullet with better aerodynamics that retained its energy even better. And in the post that I wrote recently on this very subject, I have a graph showing what that increase would look like. And you're talking about like 200 meters more range. So if you feel like 5.56 is 200 meters too short range, you could conceivably create a round that was that met that criteria that was also 5.56 caliber. So there's still a lot of development that could be done within the 22 caliber, and there's still a lot of development that could be done in the 30 caliber that may not be related to the existing 5.56 and 7.62 chamberings. So there's still a whole wide spectrum of development that can be done and ballistic optimization that can be done there. Now, getting into the really fun stuff, which is caseless and case telescoped plastic ammunition. So ever since the mid-19th century, we've had metallic cased, usually brass, but often steel cased ammunition, and that case gets tossed out of the gun. And you're tossing kind of valuable materials out of the gun every time you shoot it, steel and brass, and that material is also heavy, so it's making your ammunition heavier. Now, material science being what it is, that's been a necessary sacrifice. There's very important reasons to have those cases made out of those materials. For example, if you try to make a cartridge case out of aluminum, unless you really know what you're doing and have gotten really good at it, the aluminum tends to catch fire, which is bad. So there's been really good reasons for having those metallic cases around, but obviously it'd be really nice if either the case could be made of something a lot lighter and cheaper, or have no case at all, which is where the telescoped plastic cased and caseless ammunition is coming from. And those basically are founded around similar ideas, which is to reduce the weight of the case by either eliminating it or making it out of a new material. Plastics have come a long way since their invention. They are now more durable, stronger, more chemical resistant than they've ever been. And so there's a very serious eye right now in the military towards changing to a new configuration of plastic cased ammunition. And that configuration actually has to look a little bit different. The program is called LSAT, Lightweight Small Arms Technologies. And that case has to change because with plastic, one of the things it's really bad at is extraction. You can't make a rim out of plastic and have it hold up to the kind of acceleration that firearms action does. So you have to figure out something else to do. And what they found out to do was to make this chamber a separate moving piece, kind of like a revolver, actually. And that chamber moves out of the way, and then you have a rammer that rams the new round into the chamber, pushing the old round out of the chamber back to front, and then the chamber rotates back into position and the gun can fire. This is a very interesting concept because now the ammunition, it looks just like a cylinder. It's perfectly straight, doesn't have any taper, the bullet's not sticking out the front, and you can make that out of plastic really easily, and it's really durable. And there's no more extraction that you have to fiddle with where you're tearing rims off of plastic cases, and allows the ammunition to be much, much lighter, like 30% lighter, which is a huge gain. And you're not chucking brass out the side of the gun, which is expensive. You can chuck plastic, which is much, much cheaper. And so that's one idea, and it's a very, very promising idea. And another thing they're doing to reduce the ammunition weight with that is to make the belt links out of plastic instead of steel. So now you'd have more durable ammunition, more corrosion-resistant ammunition, and the bullet is seated way down in the case and kicked out by the initial charge. It's kicked out into sort of the throat of the barrel by the initial charge, and then propelled down the barrel, which is where the telescoped nomenclature comes from. That the bullet is telescoped into the case, it's buried into the case, and that's a very compact form factor, and that comes from sort of the caseless ammunition world. There's some improvements in propellant that were developed for the caseless ammunition project, which had been going on literally since the 60s, and the cartridge that I show in my in that post is the G11's DM11 round, which is if you've ever had the chance to hold one, any of the listeners, they are really tiny. They are really, really small. I mean, we're talking the kind of weight. I think they're lighter than a 22 Winchester Magnum. And that 4.9 by 33 or 4.73 by 33 round was a part of the G11 project that was essentially killed off by the end of the Cold War. I once heard a quip that the German government could decide to fund the G11, or they could decide to rebuild East Germany, and they decided to rebuild East Germany. So really they ran out of money. They had this tremendously expensive small arms project, and they ran out of money, and the G11 lost funding. It had a last gasp being tested by the U.S. Army in the very early 90s, but the U.S. Army did not eventually decide to fund further development of it, and that was pretty much it. And that caseless ammo is even lighter. We're talking weight savings of like 40 to 45%. But the technology that came out of that, there were a lot of challenges with the caseless ammunition. There was a lot of, the cook-off problem. I mean, it turns out that propellant is not a particularly durable like material to make a cartridge out of.
Under heat.
So, yeah, under a lot of things, like you can crush them with your hand. I mean, there's a lot of engineering problems that you have to get through. And one of the things is that propellant block is solid, and it won't ignite if it's solid. So you have to like vaporize the propellant block when the gun goes off. Like there's a bunch of engineering problems. It doesn't mean that those problems couldn't be solved. And in fact, I've talked to some of the people who were involved in that project, and according to them, Dynamit Nobel did a really good job on that ammunition and solved, over the course of about 20 years, solved a lot of its problems. And that ammunition was ready for further development and could have produced something really interesting. Unfortunately, with the end of that program, those engineers got released and a bunch of the knowledge that was there got lost, which probably set us back a little bit. But some of that engineering got wrapped into LSAT and wrapped into the plastic case development. It's a lot easier to engineer a plastic case than it is a caseless ammunition, because now you have a much more durable envelope. Yeah, the weight savings isn't as high. The cost savings is comparable because plastics are cheap. And so you have sort of a much easier engineering problem. And that's where the LSAT team picked up. They also worked on more caseless ammunition. They kind of had to try to reverse engineer the Dynamit Nobel stuff. But I think the LSAT caseless has been put basically on hold, and they're focusing on plastic cased ammo. So currently they're testing with existing 5.56 and 7.62 millimeter bullets, but the eventual eye is on a new weapon system that uses totally new ammunition. So they would use totally new projectiles and totally new configuration. Conceivably could be any one of the concepts we've talked about so far. It's actually, at this point, it's a joint U.S.-Canadian project. The Canadians are developing a bullpup carbine with a 26-inch barrel, and the Americans are developing the light machine gun, which is sort of a similar thing to an M249 saw, except instead of like 17 pounds unloaded, it's like 10 pounds unloaded, which is way better, and the ammunition is way, way lighter. So that's probably the most promising and exciting thing. There are some programs backing that up. There's the formed stainless steel cased ammunition. What they have is an aluminum plug that kind of forms the case head, and then they wrap very thin sheet stainless steel around it. And that ammunition was actually successful enough. That's in the 2013 Small Arms ammunition portfolio from PEO Soldier. So that ammunition reached a pretty high level of development and is in like field trials right now. That's like a 20% weight savings, so not bad at all.
And cheaper, I would assume.
Cheaper than existing stuff, yes. Not as cheap as LSAT, and that's one of the kind of the big betting horse is LSAT. We all hope that one pulls through and that program gets to the end. But there are backup programs. There's also an aluminum cased experimentation. That's very tricky, as I mentioned before. To get aluminum case to work, you have to put some real engineering into it for anything other than pistol calibers. Obviously, I think it's Blazer makes aluminum case pistol ammo.
Yeah.
But that stuff doesn't operate at the kind of pressures that sets those cases on fire. So,
right. Well, I mean, there you go. There's your caseless.
Yeah, there's your caseless ammo. Actually, that is how the M1 Abrams main battle tank ammunition works. They have some kind of flammable case material, and so you put a whole case in, and then it burns up, and then this little stub comes out the back. I'm not kidding.
I thought I was.
Yeah. So, and then there's also conventional layout plastic cased ammunition, composite ammo. What that would have is that it would have like a steel or an aluminum case head with the rim on it that would be durable enough to extract, and then attached to that would be a polymer body. There was an article by Alex C. on the Firearm blog where he tested some of the PCP ammunition that's also plastic cased in kind of a similar configuration.
Oh, the one that blew his foul up?
Yeah, the one that blew his foul up. And so obviously the stuff that's on the commercial market right now doesn't seem to be quite ready for prime time, to put it mildly. But that is something they're working on, and that's another potential backup program. All of these are kind of playing sort of second fiddle to LSAT because LSAT has got probably the best configuration and the most promise. And so everybody's kind of rooting for LSAT. But there are backup programs. I think the Army has an open solicitation. So if there's any ammunition developers listening to this, figure out a way to make ammunition lighter and cheaper and maybe go talk to the Army about it. Now,
before we wrap the topic up and close the show out, where do you see those, I know like the 5.7 and the 4.6 from H&K, the new PDW rounds. Mm-hmm. What role do you see those playing? I mean, are those just going to kind of fizzle out, do you think? Or is that something that you would see kind of in the future getting more of a foothold? Well,
they've got a place. They were designed because the Soviet tactics during the Cold War were based around being able to put units everywhere on the map. We think of it now kind of crudely as being like human wave, like overwhelming type tactics. And that's really an oversimplification. It was really about being able to set up ambushes wherever they could in the battlefield. And one of the ways that they did this was with airborne troops. So you can imagine in the 1980s, NATO going, okay, Soviet airborne troops are going to come out of the air with light armor on, with automatic weapons, drop into our back lines and slaughter our guys. So the pistol's not going to cut it in this scenario. We need to have better, more effective weapons for the rear echelon soldier. And that's really where the FNP 90 and the HK MP7 came from. They came from solicitations based on that. needed to be able to penetrate armor, which is why they're smaller caliber and higher velocity than regular pistol rounds. And they're fully automatic for better hit probability to kind of give these guys a fighting chance. They're easier to shoot. They're carbines instead of pistols. That's really what those are designed to do. And oh, by the way, that's still something you should be concerned about. That's a legitimate thing to be concerned about. If you ever got into a war with like China or Russia, they would try to pull that kind of crap on you. And
today now most armies actually use armor. It's not like the old days where that was very rare.
Right, and that's the other thing is that armor's proliferating, and so you're going to start having insurgents wearing light armor. The insurgents love attacking your rear lines, so that ammunition is still going to have a place. Having said that, it kind of has fallen out of favor because it suffers from a lot of the same problems that your more primitive 5.56 ammunition suffers from, and that it has a tendency to kind of go straight through the target. And so it, in certain circumstances, can have lower lethality than a standard pistol round. And so you've actually seen a rebirth of things like the 45 ACP, which is an incredibly crude way to get firepower in the hands of soldiers, this big dumb bullet that flies through the air really slowly, but carves this nice big hole in the target. And so it's kind of interesting that you've kind of had it go both ways, where because of suicide bombers and targets that need to be stopped right now, and we want to put as much firepower on them as possible, whether this psychology is borne out by ballistic testing or not. I think my regular readers will know that I am a bigger fan of 9mm than I am 45 ACP, but that thinking has led to kind of a rebirth of the larger pistol calibers like 9mm, 45, that sort of thing. Right. So how is that tug of war going to play out? I don't know. I would not count the 5.7s and the 4.6s out. They've actually been really popular. The P90 has been referred to as the savior of FN Herstal because they were bankrupt almost after the BRG-15 15mm machine gun fiasco. And then the P90 was this cheap, inexpensive submachine gun that they could sell to just about anybody. And that, and it did sell well. So those weapons have sold well. Their calibers are relevant. And certainly if you found yourself in a conventional war, I think you'd see them getting a lot more popular. Either those or like 5.56 caliber subcarbines. And one other thing to mention is when we talked about the GPC earlier, that would have to be supplemented by sort of imagine like an M1 carbine type scenario. You would have to have some kind of smaller echelon weapon. That cartridge would be way too big to have a lightweight like Mark 18 style, close quarter battle PDW type weapon based around it. Whereas you can take a 5.56 AR-15 and cut the barrel down to like 10 inches and have a pretty handy little PDW type thing from it.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is 7-inning stretch time. We invite you to join in singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game."
Patches, get your patches here. Patriot Patch Company has all your favorite flavors. Tactical, Western, sci-fi, pop culture, hot and ready. Don't forget to wash it down with a Pro Gun Custom Screen Printed t-shirt. Available in sizes medium to 5XL. They're great for any occasion. Patches, get your patches at patriotpatch.co.
Excellent. Well, Nathaniel, where can people find more about this subject? I know we have a companion article on the Firearms blog that will be linked in the show notes.
Yep.
So where can people follow you? Where can people find more about this subject?
Well, I write daily for the firearmblog.com, and I also have kind of a backup website where I post all the things I don't feel like are appropriate for the Firearm blog. It's more like just kind of basic thoughts and that sort of thing and less polished out ideas, which is 196,800 revolutions per minute, which is probably not the best thought out title in the world. But yeah, you can go find more about that. And in the show notes, like I had mentioned several times before, we will have lots of articles linked that has just more detail on all of these different subjects. That'll be something that everybody can go and if you get interested in a particular thing that I talked about and want to know more about it, we will have resources for you to learn about it. So.
Excellent. So we'll put links to that in the show notes. I want to thank you again, Nathaniel, for coming on.
Oh, it's always a pleasure coming on here, Ryan.
Gun Guy Radio says thank you and proudly displays artwork and graphics designed by Ryan Cross of Hunter of Design. hunterofdesign.com.
So that about wraps up this episode of Gun Guy Radio. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes so that you never miss a show. And please leave us a review there as well, gunguyradio.com/iTunes. Please consider joining the NRA and the Second Amendment Foundation. There are links there in the show notes. And don't forget to check out the other shows on the Firearms Radio Network. Also, be sure to check out the Patriot Patch Company, started by FRN's own Jake Challand and Ryan Cross. Patriot Patch Company offers high-quality 3D PVC vinyl patches with Velcro backing that is sure to satisfy any taste. Be sure to check them out at www.patriotpatch.co. This is Ryan Machad, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv. Hey, since you're already listening to a show on the Firearms Radio Network, then you should check out the God and Guns podcast. Troy and Doug talk about guns from a Christian perspective and, of course, God. GodandGunsPodcast.com/iTunes. Subscribe now. Machine gun shoots are the quintessential way to celebrate being an American. Come to the Stone Mountain Machine Gun Shoot on April 30th through May 1st to get your freedom on. Stone Mountain features a dedicated machine gun range spanning over 100 yards with a section for individuals to shoot their own. Don't own a machine gun? No problem. Machine gun rentals will be available. Interested in demoing the latest silencers from SIG Silencers, Silencer Co., Liberty Suppressors, and other top brands? Then come see our silencer range nestled in the hills of Stone Mountain, where you can try before you buy. Oh, there's more. Is engaging targets while flying down a zip line something you ever wanted to try? We've got you covered. You'll be able to demo some of the newest guns and silencers on the market. For more information, visit stonemachinegun.com. Brought to you by the Shooter's Gauntlet and the Firearms Industry Consulting Group.